And they have to do with setting up the limits of how far you can go in designing creatures one way or another. Just as the architects of the Master Universe design space levels, nebulae, and so forth. So here you've got a number of functions that are taking place which come under the heading of inception. Number one, the basic design for the super universe. Number two, the basic design for the limits of creature and creator choice, the range of free will choice in the second universe age. Number three, the design of the physical units of matter. Number four, the basic design of living beings. Now, within these frameworks, all the creators, manipulators, organizers, and administrators, they do all kinds of things. To use an analogy, it's the architects of the Master Universe who say there are 53 cards in the deck. The Joker is wild in aces, straights, and flushes. This is draw poker. They write the rules. Now you sit down and you play draw poker, and they don't tell you how to play. But they determine the fact that we're going to play draw poker and when the Joker is wild. This is not spit in the ocean, and this is not 7-card stud. This is draw poker with the Joker wild in aces, straights, and flushes only. That's what the architects do. Now all the rest of the folks, they come out here, and you can sit down and you can be a lousy poker player, you can be a good poker player, you can be lucky or unlucky. You're on your own now. But you haven't got a darn thing to say about where the Joker's wild. Does that kind of make sense?
They have certain latitudes, but it's confined.
It's confined. It's within the limits of the game. It's like bridge. There are rules of bridge, and you don't violate them. And because there are these rules, it makes the game fun. And this doesn't have a darn thing to do with your wisdom or your downright stupidity in how you bid and how you play. And it's a wonderful game. It's about the only card game I'm willing to sit up late and play. Chess is the same way. You've got your rules laid down. But within those rules, my Lord, how many moves can you make? You know, they can teach a computer to play checkers, but they haven't yet found out how to teach a computing machine how to play chess, because there are too many possibilities. The machine can't digest them. This thing goes up into real large numbers now. Checkers are fairly simple. You've only got two kinds of pieces and only certain possible moves, but consider all the moves of chessmen. And you hit all the squares on the chessboard, and you only hit every other square on the chessboard. A computer can play checkers, but a computer can't play chess. At least we haven't got a computer big enough.
Yes.
Yes, we may get one. Did you folks see the cartoon of the two little teeny weeny scientists in white coats in front of this absolutely colossal machine? And they've just asked it a question. The question is there a God? And the answer which has come out is not until recently. I get a kick out of talking about this because this happens to be the thing I'm working on. I'll probably go to work on when I get back to Chicago. It'll be Appendix 15. Appendix 15 right now is about 6 pages long, and I think when we get it work, it'll be about 30. And it'll be one of the last, I think, that'll have real growth to it. Maybe.
I'm dismayed that I read the last year not over 3 weeks ago, or something. 3 weeks, I think, for it. And I swear I just, architects of the
It's tucked away so neatly there. You could overlook it.
Frustrating, is it? Very frustrating. Only place in the book I'll bet money now.
It's the only place in the book it's mentioned.
Frustrating.
Well, it has parentheses unrevealed. So
Unrevealed, that's right.
why they're not there.
But now, I'm going to put it in our discussion of transcendentalism. I'm going to say, now look, we don't know that these are transcendentalists, but it's not an unreasonable guess. Why did they call them architects? They didn't expect that we'd associate them with the architects of the master universe. Now this is the kind of guessing I think is legitimate to me. These are reasonable guesses. It's like, it's like saying, well, I think the White Sox might have a chance at the pennant. Now that's not a stupid forecast, but if I say I think the Cubs might win, that's just wishful thinking. That's a stupid guess.
That gives me an indication where you might live.
That's right. Then you've got the question of consummation. The papers use these terms. I got my idea of using them to think with over here. Where am I now? No, I'm a long ways away. I'm not either. Yeah. Some of you folks are working on deity and reality. Well, that's where they come out of.
We haven't worked hard enough for this.
Over on page 1171. And if you look up these darn words, you see what they're trying to drive at. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, paragraph 5. They're talking about the three trinities, and they say, 1171, paragraph 5, they say the association of these three trinities and the Trinity of Trinities provides for a possible unlimited integration of reality. This grouping contains causes, intermediaries, and finals, inceptors, or causes, realizers, or intermediaries, and consummators, or finals, beginnings, existences, and destinies, or to group them in accordance with similarity of meaning. Causes are like inceptors, and inceptors are like beginnings. Intermediaries are like realizers, and realizers are like existences. Finals are like consummators, and consummators are like destinies. And I kind of think that as the architects and their associates are inceptors, the layers out of the subdivision, so the creators are the construction boys that come in and build the houses. And then I think the two of them get together to try to bring about consummation. In the finite sense, the Supreme Being is a consummator. He concludes things. Example, and this is not a speculation on my part, I'm quoting the papers there. Consider what happened when the Master Spirits had their workout with Paradise deities in producing reflecting spirits. They each produced 7, which gives us 49. And that exhausted all possibilities for collaboration, and he stepped in and produced the 50th. And this was a real rumble now that went all the way to the deity absolute and back again. And we got Macheston, who is the unifier of the whole process of reflectivity. I think when the Supreme Being is spoken of as a consummator and as a culminator, which is a synonym for consummation. a finisher, a finalizer, a destiny attainer. We will consummate finite destiny because the Supreme Being will help us. They tell us that just as Jesus is a bridge from man to God, so the Supreme Being is a bridge from the finite to the superfinite. We need him to make it, just like we need Jesus or his equivalent to understand God. If you have consummation through the working out, the working together of inceptors and realizers, plus something new on the finite level, then is the ultimate a consummator on the epsonite level. And of course this gets real interesting, because in the second experiential trinity, you have a consummator of destiny present in that trinity. Now, in the appendix, I go right up and ask the question, is this significant? But I'm smart enough not to try to answer that question. That's beyond speculation. We can speculate up to the point of raising the question, but we just don't have anything on which to base an answer. But I think their usage of these words in here is very helpful. It helps me understand the architect. They don't create, they incept, which is, they are to a contractor what a subdivision operator is. He's a guy that opens up the subdivision, and there's just no use going in there to sell houses and build houses till you got your subdivision set up. I think I'm right on that, isn't that the way it works? Or, a seismograph crew does not drill for oil, but I'm told that it's real smart to drill based on the findings of a seismograph crew. Is that right, Mr. Kelly?
Some areas.
Some areas, all right.
Yes,
Well, then the
Bible.
seismograph boys are inceptors, explorers, but they're not the boys that go in and produce.
I usually travel on location and dig big, build the road. But not spud.
Evidently, there are 3 stages to making things happen. Getting them off the ground, then doing something about them, then bringing them to a conclusion. For example, in our Goldie loaned me the story over there. In the final speculation, which we engage in, you might get a kick out of this. This is where we're really out with a breaststroke swimming through infinity. This is the second epilogue. The trinitization of God the Absolute and the massive breakthrough into the cosmos infinite opens up unending vistas of growth and progress beyond the confines of the Master Universe, out into the final expanse of the limitless universe. The breaching of the barrier of infinity opens up all future eternity to endless speculation, so much so that it becomes needful to build some conceptual dikes lest we be flooded by a very ocean of speculative and subjunctive possibilities, ifs that could go on and on into final absurdity. So, in an effort to make the final age in the cosmos infinite somewhat intelligible, we propose to establish 3 concept boundaries to our thinking. Stage 1. The first stage of the cosmos infinite. We identify with its innermost zone, that part of the endless universe that actualizes as a repercussion of the trinitized appearance of God the Absolute. Stage 2. We visualize the second stage of the cosmos infinite. See, stage one is inception. We visualize the second stage of the cosmos infinite as an intermediate stage of development, as a stage following upon the factualization of the innermost zone. This phase of intermediate development may or may not have an end, a conclusion. Stage 3. This final stage of the expansive growth of the never-ending cosmos may be a purely theoretical consideration. But even if it never becomes a factual reality, it still may be a valid concept. What we are trying to do in establishing these classifications of 3 stages of progress is to create some framework for thinking about the endless universe. It is conceptually unimportant as to whether there are 3 or 7 or 1,000,000 divisions. We elect 3 classifications because it is the minimum number that will accommodate the presentation of the concept of beginnings, intermediates, and destinies, of inception, realization, and consummation. I think those are safe assumptions, and it keeps the thing within bounds. Because believe me, you're out there in the big blue yonder, and there's no bottom with a deep sea line, you know. And 3 seems to be a wieldy number. I think this is the difference between writing metaphysics and writing fantasy. And I'm not interested in fantasy. I don't care whether we make mistakes in here or not, as long as they're intelligent mistakes, logical mistakes. This I know we're going to make. But so just let's be logical and intelligent and reasonable. And after all, it doesn't make any difference how many divisions there are. 3 is all we need for thinking purposes. I can see the first one getting off the ground and getting finished. I can see the second one getting started, but I'm not so sure I can see it finished. And the third one I think is purely for thinking purposes. We theorize about the third. How about it, boss? It's 10:30. Well, listen, will you help me?
Right.
Tell you what we'll do. Any of you that are interested in the appendices, fine. But I'm not asking you for help there. I mean, if you get into it and see something, please let me know. But I am asking you to help me on the story. Because if the story isn't easy, I haven't written it well enough. And I will continue to write it and rewrite it as long as you folks ask questions. And each time we do another version, I'll send it to you. Because what I do is, you see, I've got a copy of a smooth draft of what Burke has. What I do is I work over that draft up there. If it gets too messy, I'll retype a page or 2. If there's only a little handwriting on it, I'll just leave it the way it is. And then when I copy it, I'll send that down here. And this way you'll have the fun of seeing the story grow. Only I hope I don't get sick again. You know, I can remember when both of those went in a single binder and it was a standard binder. This is an oversized, this is a king-size binder, and that's the biggest one in there. Yeah, it is. I was conned into it, Goldie. I didn't realize what it was. If I had, I never would have. Oh, it's nice to see
Oh,
you,
yes,
Bill.
you would have, because you were motivated to do it. You wouldn't have been taught.
Yeah, but I kind of got conned into it, you know. It's like the story, you know, the girl in Cutter. when she went away to college and she came home pregnant, and her mother said, "Didn't I tell you to say no?" Well, she says, "Mom, it took me too long."
When I was beginning to say,
But I did, I know.
It took me too long. Are we on the air?
Well, that was like, I had to take it, I had to find maybe we should open up a meeting place.
Almighty Father on paradise, as we assemble this evening with unity of thought and purpose, we thank you deeply for your holy word as we find it in these papers that you've sent to guide us on our way through life. Help us to rely on it and use it in our everyday contacts with heaven. And Father, as we study and disseminate the deeper meanings of these papers, let it so reflect in our everyday lives that it may be an inspiration to us. Give us the ability and the wisdom to impart the knowledge to others. Guide us in our efforts and bless us in our calling. We'll give Jesus the praise. Amen.
Thank you, J.J. Bill's going to tell us a little story tonight on deity and reality and universal reality.
That's fine.
I'm not going to try to read the papers to you. I'm just going to tell you what they mean to me. And if I get over anybody's head, stop me. Let's have a question and we'll take it from there. These two papers together deal with something that has a 4-bit term in theology. They deal with eschatology. And that's paper 105 and 106. And all eschatology means is, where in the dickens did it come from and where the heck is it going? That's eschatology. They start out with the idea of an infinite being. An infinite being that we're probably never going to know as infinite. And to all practical intents and purposes, this is God. Technically, when we start out, this being is pre-God, pre-Father. But from a practical standpoint, we might just as well think of him as God or as Father. Of course, technically, he can't be a father before he has any children. But at least he's a being who is going to be a father. The papers try to start out by describing something that can't be described, which is a condition in which God fills everything. Let's think of infinity as a bucket. If we call it by common names, then we'll quit being afraid of it. Think of, a bucket like you haul a bucket of water in. Let that symbolize infinity. In the beginning, God fills the bucket. There's nothing in there but God, or the infinite. He can't do anything, because there's no room to do anything. There's nowhere that he isn't. There's no room for anything else. And all of the story in paper 105 is the story of how God makes room for folks like us and for everything else which is not God. Does that make sense? Because if you've got that bucket full of water, you can't get anything else in there, can you? You got to make some room. They tell us that when we try to think of the infinite, what we're going to wind up thinking about is God. In one place where they're talking about the Father, back in part 1, they say we all crave the concept of the infinite, but we worship our experience relationship to God. God is that part of the infinite which we can experience as a real experience in our hearts and souls. So please remember, whenever you think of the infinite, don't be afraid, because that's God to you. That's the Father to you. And the face which the infinite turns toward mankind is the Father's face. And if you want to understand the Father, you wind up by thinking about Jesus, because nothing beyond Jesus is very comprehensible. And heaven knows, he is comprehensible. You can really understand what God would be like if God were a man. I don't understand God, but I certainly can understand the human side of Jesus of Nazareth, because he was an honest-to-goodness human being. So I'd like to start out this paper by going right from the infinite to the carpenter and anchoring the two together. The most incomprehensible thing in the papers is the infinite. And yet, in his relationship to us, he is the most understandable of all. You see, basically, we can understand God better than we can understand any other being, because every other being we have to learn about from the outside. God is the only other being that we can learn about from the inside. In knowing God, we are not dependent on anything outside of ourselves, because he lives inside of us. Even Jesus has to knock to get in. When the papers try to tell us how things came to be, they start out by telling us how God made some room in the bucket. And he made room in this bucket of infinity by pulling himself to one side and creating places where he was not, so that other things could be. And the first thing he did was to pull himself aside and produce something which was not deity, not God. And then he existed in relationship to this not deity reality. You know, the unqualified absolute, I think one of the best names that was ever applied to him was applied by a Persian theologian, a Zoroastrian, who was poking fun at the book of Genesis. Because, you know, the Zoroastrians were quite competitive with both Jews and Christians during the times of the early Roman Empire. And this Zoroastrian, writing from Persia, where it was the official state religion, wrote a critique of Genesis. And he said it's the most ridiculous thing you ever read, because it says God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And he said this proves that God was not alone, because there must have been an obeyer of commands there, or else where did the light come from? There was not only he who commanded, but there was also an obeyer of commands. And I think that's a good way of looking at non-deity, the unqualified absolute. The unqualified absolute is an obeyer of commands. And those commands, in the last analysis, come from God. They may go through a lot of steps, through a lot of transitions, God may be working with the Son and the Spirit in the Trinity when he actually gives the command. But the obeyer of command is the unqualified absolute. This first description is what the papers are talking about when they talk about the separation of the infinite one from the infinitude. The infinite one is that reality which is God, which is becoming God. The infinitude is the reality which is not God, not deity, where something can happen. Now, you still have the infinity, because while God, in a way, separates these, in a way, he doesn't separate them. All the diagrams that you have on this blackboard are real at the same time, because we think of them in sequence. And we sort of figure, well, if God separates infinity, that's that. But God separates infinity, and yet he doesn't separate infinity. Let me give you a good symbol for this. The Trinity is hard to think of. How can it be 1 and 3? How can you have 3 circles up there and still have only 1? Well, just think of a tree, which grows out of one trunk into 3 branches. And it depends on what level you work on this tree. If you work 12 feet up, you've got 3. If you work 3 feet up, you have 1. At one point, the tree is 1. A little higher up, it's 3. Now, what is the tree? 1 or 3? It's 1 and 3, isn't it? And let's say there were 2 people, a little guy and a tall guy, and they each had real stiff necks, and they couldn't look up or down. And the real tall guy, he looks straight ahead because he can't look up or down, his neck is stiff. And all he can see is 3. And the little guy, he isn't that tall. He looks ahead and he only sees 1. And can't you imagine the argument that they get into between themselves? Is it a 1 or is it a 3? And so the monotheists and the Trinitarians have been arguing for a long, long time about oneness and threeness. That same thing applies to these circles up here. When the papers tell us that even after God has separated them, they still are not separated. In other words, you have threeness and oneness. You have the associative level and the static level. Which level are you working on? Are you looking at it where it's 1, or are you looking at it where it's 3? A little higher up, it's 7. You know? Does this make sense? I want you to get a feeling for the fact that something can be 1 and still be 3 at the same time. And I can't think of anything better than a tree to illustrate that point. There's 1 trunk, it's still there even after it has 3 branches. And after it has 3 branches, the 1 trunk is still there as a 1, and the 3 branches are still there as a tree, as 3, and you still have 1 tree. When you separate 1 circle into 2, and then join it with a 3rd, you have not destroyed the 1 circle. The 1 circle is still there. The 3 circles are there at the same time. The 1 trunk is there. The 3 branches are there. And because there are 3 branches, it does not destroy the trunk. Does this make sense? All right. That's what I think the paper means when it says, over here on page 1154, we separate the infinite one from the infinitude, but we still have the infinity. That's in paragraph 2. We have now God and not God. But we still have what we had before we ever did anything. 3 branches do not destroy a single trunk out of which they spring. Greetings.
His mother,
What do we do about birds turning off too? You have 3 at one level doesn't destroy the fact that you have 1 at another level. Here's another way you can think about these 3 absolutes, which are 3 and still 1. Instead of thinking of them as circles, think of them as 3 links in a chain. Think of them as 3 pieces of wire that are make perfect circles. Now, as you come down and look at them from time and space, pull them out. Make a real chain out of them. But the nearer you get to infinity and eternity, the more they tend to push together. And when you finally push them together, if you look at them from the right angle, you only see 1 circle, because they're one on top of another. And the minute you get away from infinity, they begin to branch out, and you begin to see the 3ness again. The closer you are to infinity, the nearer you are to pushing these 3 links together, so that they become 1 circle. And the farther away you go from infinity, the more they tend to fan out as a 3-link chain. Does that idea help a little bit? Can you see those links coming closer together and getting farther apart? When we go from 3 to 7, we go in a series of steps. As Burke has drawn this idea out, she starts with a single circle. She compresses it around the middle, making a kind of an hourglass out of it. Then she comes up with 2 circles, and then she unites them with a middle circle. There's a dot in one of those circles, and that dot stands for God's will, you might say. He wants to get out of that circle for the same reason that he wants to separate the 2 circles to begin with. He's still making room in infinity to do something in. So, he is the absolute person. He moves out of the circle. And this changes the name of that circle. This is no longer total deity. This is the deity absolute. The potential or the room in which things can happen. You see, we started out thinking of infinity as a bucket, and it's full. And because it's full, it lacks a very great virtue. There was an old Chinese philosopher by the name of Lao Tzu who says, the virtue of an empty vessel is that it can be filled. And what God is doing is producing some emptiness so that he can, let's say, adventure, if you please. When he removes himself as the absolute person, as total deity, from that right-hand circle, I think as you're looking at it, he changes the nature of the circle. The circle is still deity. But it's no longer actual deity, it's potential deity. But he has to do some things in order to remove himself from that circle. He's got to stop being the absolute person. So he removes himself from the absolute person. Think of this as taking your coat off. Let that coat symbolize the absolute person. You remove it from yourself. You have now caused it to exist apart from yourself, haven't you? If God causes something to exist apart from himself, then he has created that something, hasn't he? If that something is a person, then that which God created is his son, is it not? That makes God the father of that person. This is the first son. And this makes God a father of this first son. At the same time that God did this, he built a piece of machinery. He built paradise. Paradise is the absolute machine. It's the governor of material existence. It does repetitive things and does them in absolute perfection. This machine doesn't break down. God is the engineer that designed it and built it, and it works forever. When God separates himself from the absolute person, he still wants to work with that absolute person who is his son. And this desire to work together personalizes in the third person of deity, who is the expression of the fact that the Father and the Son are always going to be working together. And then the three of them form a corporation so that they can work together as a single entity. And it's this corporation which they put back in the circle where the dot used to be. They replace God's being with the being or entity of the Trinity. And this, now we're back down to the trunk again. This is the unity of deity and not the three-way personalization of deity. The paper goes on to discuss 6 relationships or 6 aspects of the infinite. And I asked Burke if she could find me a cube, and she's got a box of bath powder out here, which she tells me if I'll open up, it's got a very passionate powder puff in there, and we'll just let that one lay. Think of this as, it's pretty close to a cube. It's got 6 sides, hasn't it? At this point, we're thinking of the infinite, and I think a cube is the best possible way we could think of the infinite. Because each one of these sides has a relationship to one of the absolutes. You know, I know I need a 7th side. I'll get to that. Don't worry about it. The papers on page 1154 describe the 6 sides of this cube. One side is called, I am Father of the eternal Son. Another side is called, I am Cause of eternal paradise. I am one with the eternal Son. I am self-associative. I am self-qualified. I am static, reactive. That's each one of these sides. This cube also has an internal relationship, a relationship to itself. And the name which they give to the inside relationship of this cube is, I am as I am. And the name which they give to the inside relationship of this cube is, I am as I am. That is God's relationship to himself as an absolute. Now, I wish you'd think of this cube. I hate to keep holding it up in the air, but I want to imagine suspending it. I wish you'd think of this cube, and I wish you'd think of six spheres in relation to this cube, 6 globes, each one about the size of a fist. There's one opposite every side, and there's one inside the cube. These 6 globes, about the size of a tennis ball or a little bigger, on the outside, plus one on the inside, these are the 7 absolutes of infinity, existing in relationship to the infinite. I think of the globe that's on the inside, that's the first source and center. And then taking inventory of the ones on the outside. Opposite, I am Father of the Eternal Son. That's the name of this side of the cube. Opposite that, we have a globe. That's called the second source and center. You get the picture? Opposite, I am Cause of Eternal Paradise, is the Paradise source and center, the absolute machine. Opposite, the side which has the name, I am one with the Eternal Son, is the third source and center. Opposite the side which says, I am self-associative, is the universal absolute. Opposite the side which is named, I am self-qualified, is the deity absolute. And opposite the side which has the name, I am static reactive, is the unqualified absolute. And again, opposite I am as I am, that's the sphere that's on the inside, and that's the first source and center. God's relationship within himself, or the relationship of which the infinite has to himself as an absolute. That's got to be internal. Does the cube help you a little bit? With the 6 balls, one opposite each side, and one on the inside, in with the bath powder. Well, let's go back just a second, JB. Go back to page 1155 and take a look at the 4th paragraph there.
On page
1155. I am as I am. That is the relationship which the infinite has to the first source and center. And really, they're the same reality, aren't they? On different levels. We're talking now about the relationship which the infinite has to the 3rd floor of a firehouse. They describe it as the stasis or self-relationship of infinity. And if it's a self-relationship, I think it's internal and not external. I can't quite see where the first source and center belongs outside of the infinite, but I can see where the first source and center fits inside of the infinite. The first source and center, to me, is unique and won't quite classify with anything else. He's deity, but he's also non-deity. He's everything. I can't get the first source and center away from the center. I can have all of these others external to the cube, but I can't visualize the first source and center outside of the cube. I can visualize it inside of the cube. Think of the cube as being hollow, and then there's room for a sphere inside of it. Now we've got some room in which to take action. And the first action which is taken is the production of the central universe of Havona. And please remember that Havona is real on all levels There are finite things in Havona. There are absonite things in Havona. There are absolute things in Havona. There are creatures out on the outer Havona circuit, which they tell us are the eternal prototypes of human beings. They had these creatures in mind when they figured us out later on. Now, they're not imperfect creatures, they're perfect creatures, but they're finite creatures. Nothing which is ever going to appear anywhere is not in Havona on a pattern basis. Nothing good. Evil is not there. But finite beings are there. Finite beings who were born perfect, who are naturally perfect, as someday we will become perfected. Havona is finite. Havona is absonite. Havona is absolute. And Havona is all points in between. Are you with me? Finite reality is eternal. Absonite reality is eternal. Absolute reality is eternal. But these realities are eternal only in the perfect sense of the word. And you know darn well Havona has to be finite in part, or it could never serve as a pattern universe for finite universes, could it? And it is the pattern universe. I think it's the pattern universe for everything that is ever going to be from here on out. They will always look to Havona and say, well, now this is the way we should have it. Why, certainly. Certainly. The only catch is they haven't told us about absonite Havona. They've only told us about finite Havona. You know, you think again, the eternal Son set the pattern for bestowal by bestowing himself in Havona. But he did not bestow himself as a finite being. This was a transcendental bestowal. It happened in the days of Grand Fanda. And I'm pretty sure that Grand Fanda didn't know that the Eternal Son was there, because he was working on a different level. But the firstborn Creator Son came through maybe a little later. And what he did in Havona was to reveal on the finite level what the Eternal Son had portrayed on a super finite level. And Grand Fanda knew what this Michael Son was up to. When we go to Havona on our way into paradise, I think we're going to perceive what's there. But I don't think we're going to see anything except finite reality. Or beings that are real on the finite level. They may extend beyond the finite level, but they at least are real on the finite level. If there's anything in Havona that has no finite reflection, it's super finite exclusively, we won't know it's there any more than we are aware of, let's say, the presence of a seraphim in this room. And there might be one here. And I don't refer to Mary Catherine either. Although her cookies are sporadic. I think someday we'll go through Havona and maybe we will have evolved beyond the finite level. And I think the first time we ever have that happen, we're going to say, Holy Toledo, where did all this come from? It's just like, let's say you were colorblind. Then you get your eyes fixed, and all of a sudden you see everything in color. You folks remember The Wizard of Oz, the movie years ago, that started out black and white in Kansas. When you got to the land of Oz, all of a sudden it was brilliant color. Something like that, only more so. We'll see a lot that we never saw before. We'll hear a lot that we never heard before. When God produces finite reality in the same universe that has absolute reality, he's got to have middle reality because the two are too far apart. You know the story of the Swede that came late for the liner that was sailing? and his buddy was aboard, and he was running down the dock trying to get on this boat, and they pulled the gangplank in, and the boat had gotten about 15 feet away from the dock, and Ole was jumping up and down on the rail on the boat, and he screamed out, he says, "Yump, Fergie, yump, you can make it in 3 yump." Well, that's the trouble with finite reality in relation to absolute reality. It's 3 jumps away. You can't jump that far. And so there's a middle reality called absonite reality. And absonite reality is time and space and is not time and space. For example, you remember Jesus thought adjuster. When Jesus said that Jesus put his personalized adjuster in charge of all the celestial forces down here, and says, now be sure that nothing happens that isn't in accordance with my Father's will. And his thought adjuster warned him. He said, this will do. But please remember, I'm not time conscious. And if you want to do something that merely involves getting around time, this won't mean a thing to me. I'll just have to pass it right on through because you're talking language I don't understand. Time has no meaning to me whatsoever. You may know people like this, they're procrastinators. They're kind of like that thought adjuster. Time has no meaning to them at all. I visited a Catholic monastery one time, and my host was a monk, and we went in the abbot's office, and there was a lot of correspondence filed. These were all letters addressed to these monks. And old Father Raymond laughed, and he says, he'll get around to sorting them out, delivering them someday. He says, the abbot lives in eternity. The absolute level is timeless and spaceless, and I haven't the least idea what that means, because I'm a time-space creature. When they say something is timeless and spaceless, all they're saying is, Buster, you don't know anything about this, and I won't even speculate about it. This is completely outside of my comprehension. As much as the word infinity is, as much as the word eternity is. A word like infinity, eternity, and absolute really has no meaning, does it? We have these words in English, but we do not really know what they mean. But this in-between reality is absonite. And I can understand absonite a little bit. An absonite being understands time, but is not limited by it. He understands space, but is not limited by it. The 3 absonite traits that we're most familiar with in our theology are omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence. And we're told that these are absonite traits. They're not absolute. These are the biggest ideas we can conceive about God, aren't they? Somebody who can do anything, who is everywhere, and who knows everything. But these are not absolute traits. These are absonite traits. Everything that's happened so far that we've been talking about is perfect. And it's perfect without having gone through any growth. The finite beings in Havona are perfect without going to school. They know how to spell without studying. They know all their multiplication tables without looking at any books. If I talked to you, maybe these other people would understand it better. They're born with this knowledge. They earned nothing. They just started out knowing what they needed to know, being what they needed to be. They're existential beings. Now, at a certain point down the line, God changes the rules. And he says, from here on out, people are going to have to learn. And that's when the first experiential beings came into existence. And the first ones probably were the seven master spirits, because we're told they're not existential. They are experiential. They're high beings, but they can learn, they can experiment, they can grow. And that's when they started our type of creation, imperfect creation. And that's when they planned the whole master universe, starting from here on out. And just to make the master universe real simple, let's deal with it in 3 units. Because for thinking purposes, there are only 3 units. We have the central universe that started perfect and is always going to be perfect. That's the universe that has no beginning. That's the universe which God personally created with his Son and through their Spirit. And it's flawless. That's the universe that people kind of wonder about when they say, well, if God is all good and if God is all powerful, then how come all the evil in this world? And if God had personally created this world, well, it wouldn't be this world, and believe me, we wouldn't be here. We'd be one of the worlds in Havona. And I don't think there's room for folks like us in Havona. So I'm kind of glad that they have other types of creation. He starts out, the second thing we think about are the 7 super universes. And the third thing are the outer universes. Have you got that in mind? The central universe, the super universes, and the outer universes. The big difference between the super universes and the central universe is he subtracted perfection from us. He starts us out imperfect. And so right away, we're very different from even finite creatures in the central universe. We're imperfect creatures. And out here in time and space, there are a lot of things that appear which never appeared in the central universe. Evil is one of them. In the central universe, they don't need it. We need it out here. How could any one of us choose the better if we weren't confronted with the worser as an alternative? The only way we know the better is to have an alternate. We understand white only in terms of contrasting black. We understand the good only in terms of relative bad. We start out, we don't know our multiplication tables when we're born. We have to learn the language. We start out as little savages. Anybody who's had kids knows that. And if our parents are fairly successful, by the time we go to college, we're fair barbarians. Now, we may or may not become civilized people. Some people stop at that level, and some people go on and become relatively civilized. But we really start out at the bottom of the heap. And we have a chance to grow. And to grow all the way up to the equivalent of our counterparts in Havona. We're never going to be perfect. We become perfected, which is a different kind of finite creature. A perfect being has always got it made. He doesn't know what it's like to be in jeopardy. But we sure know. We know the big difference between, we know what evil is. We may know what sin is too. We know disharmony as well as harmony. We know ugliness as well as beauty. We not only know truth, but we know untruth. We're aware not only of goodness, but of badness. We know not only beauty, we know the lack of beauty. You look at a big city, you can tell it's ugly, can't you? And you can tell exactly where it's beginning to be beautiful, can't you? These things we know, we feel them. In Havona, they have nothing ugly. It's always been beautiful. But it's not beautiful because they earned it and figured it out. It's beautiful because they inherited it. Let's consider two human beings. Here's a chap that was born rich. He had every advantage. He went to the finest schools, never had to do a day's work in his life, and he's a wonderful guy. One of the finest people you ever met. The wealth didn't spoil him. Here's another chap. He grew up an orphan. He had to fight for everything he got. He scrabbled his way through school. It took him longer because he had to work part-time. He's climbed to a pretty good position. Both of these men are about 40. Both married, both have nice families. They're equally nice people. But the fellow that had to climb up from the bottom knows a lot of things that the fellow that didn't have to make that climb will never know. Isn't that right? Haven't you known people like that? Well, the Havona native was born rich. And folks, we were born poor. We've got to scrabble it out and get there under our own steam. The Havona native was born on home plate. We got to start on first base and run bases. We'll get to home plate, just like he. But we'll have had an experience which he never had. We'll have an experience of running those bases. We got to make our first million, and he was born with his first million all in the bank. God produced a difference in the time-space creations when he subtracted perfection. He gave us a chance to have finite experience. And we would naturally think that this is going to be true always. But it isn't true always. Because when we go into outer space, he's going to subtract something again. He's going to subtract the chance to have finite experience. And the people that are born in the outer universes are going to be just as different from us as we are different from Havona natives. And I can't figure out what they're going to be like any more than the Havona native could have figured out what we were going to be like until he met us. You see, if you've never seen an imperfect critter, how could you picture one? If you're colorblind, how can the color red be explained to you? You've never seen it. And I don't believe we can possibly figure what these folks are going to be like, except they're going to be just as different from us and the Havona natives as we are different from the Havona natives and as they are different from us. We know they're going to be missing in finite experience. But when you take that away, you take away from me everything I know. Because finite experience is the only thing I've had any experience with. And I can't possibly imagine what these folks are going to be like. Can you? It's hard enough to imagine a Havona native. Except you can kind of figure he's our opposite. You know, he's just born the way we're trying to get to be. The reason we can have finite experience is because out here in time and space, the Supreme Being is growing. Just as in these outer universes, God the Ultimate is growing. Now, who are these people? Well, there are three persons of eternal or existential deity. And there are going to be three persons of sub-eternal or experiential deity. How does this work? Well, I like to think of the Paradise Trinity as being like a light. And if you please, let's have 3 movie screens now on 3 different levels. And the lowest one we'll call finite. And the next one we'll call absonite. And the top one we'll call absolute. If you put a lens in front of white light, you get a rainbow effect, don't you? All 7 colors come out. And I think that's just the way the 7 master spirits distribute the Trinity. They break the white light of the Trinity down into the rainbow of 7 colors. And if you put another lens in front of that rainbow, you can get white light again, can't you? Any of you that have worked with stage lighting know that you make your best white light, not with white light, you make it by mixing colored light, don't you? So, let's put a second lens. Now we're back to white light again. But something's happened when it's been broken down and recombined. And when that white light that's been recombined shines on the finite screen, this is no longer the eternal, existential white light of the Paradise Trinity. This is sub-eternal and experiential. And what shines on the finite screen is the beginning of the Supreme Being. And what shines on the Absonite, the next screen up, is the beginning of the ultimate. And the Trinity shines pretty direct on the top screen, and that's the beginning of absolute deity. We can grow in finite experience because the Supreme Being is growing. And I think one of the simplest ways of considering the growth of the Supreme Being is this. Every time we do something good, we add to his growth. And every time we do something bad, we subtract from his growth. There are a lot of us, and no one of us can add a great deal or subtract a great deal. But the fact remains we are adding and we are subtracting. If all the human beings on this world should not only want to do the will of God, but should be reasonably successful in doing the will of God, then this world would recognize the sovereignty of the Supreme Being, and his evolution would be pretty well completed as far as this world is concerned. And when that became true on all worlds, everywhere, in the hearts of all men, all angels, and all other beings, that's another way of saying that all imperfection would be gone from the time-space universe, and they would have become perfect, just exactly like Havona is perfect. When everyone not only wants to do God's will, but is successful in doing it. There's the difference. There's the rub. Now, it is not enough to want. You must succeed. You know all the argument there is between faith and works? You remember? Which one gets you into heaven? Well, they got 2 yardsticks. As far as God the Father is concerned, it's faith. But as far as the Supreme Being is concerned, it's works. If you want to do good, that you're in good with the Father. But as far as the Supreme Being is concerned, you've got to learn to do good. You've got to produce. All during the growth period down here, and before the Supreme Being has completed his growth, we're hooked up with God from an administrative standpoint through what the papers call God the Sevenfold. That's a whole association of all the beings with whom we have to do, starting out with Michael, the sovereign of our local universe, and going on up through the super universe into the central universe and to God himself on Paradise. When the papers talk about, we're getting over into the second paper now, when the papers talk about the primary association of finite functionals, let's analyze that. How is the finite held together as a functioning reality before it's perfected? Why do they use the word primary? Because this is the first type of unification they're going to talk about. If you'll notice, they go from primary to secondary, then tertiary, then quartan, then fifth phase, then sixth phase. This is the first bringing together, or unifying. And during all the growth periods of the seven superuniverses, it's God the sevenfold that makes it hang together. And I think the simplest way of thinking about this is consider what Jesus did here on earth. And this is God the sevenfold in action, in time and space. I think you should expand God the sevenfold because it's not only Michael's bestowal, it's the bestowal of all the other paradise sons that augment God the sevenfold. It's not only what Michael does on this world, it's the bestowal of every Avenal son on every world in the local universe. God the sevenfold is God wherever you meet him in time and space, or whoever represents God to you at any given time, at any moment. Help you with the ancient days. I think to comprehend the Michaels, you've got to add the Avenals to them. They're an extension of the Michael. I think of God the sevenfold as embracing many extensions besides just the ones that are named, you know. I'd add all the Avenals to the Creator Sons because they're bestowed sons too, and they speak for God on the inhabited world. Not in quite the same language. They don't say, he who has seen me has seen the universal Father, but they do say, he who has seen me has seen the eternal Son, which is the next thing. Primary association of finite functionals simply means that no matter how imperfect things are, they will always be tied together with God in the same way that Jesus ties man to God. This thing will be made to work, perfect or imperfect, regardless. Not in the sense of plowing anybody under, but in the sense of keeping the door of opportunity always open to all beings. No matter where you are in the universe, no matter how imperfect it is, this is God's technique for reaching you at any time or place. That's what this association is. This is God the sevenfold in action. God working in time and space through his sons, through his spirits, through any agency that functions for God. It all will tie in to God the sevenfold at one level or another. The thought adjusters tie into the universal Father. Spirit gravity is associated with the eternal Son. Mind in relation to spirit is associated with the infinite Spirit. Super-universe coloration, if you please, and time-space mind comes from the seven master spirits. Trinity administration is focalized in the Ancients of Days. Creation and local administration is focalized in the Creator Sons, their associated creative spirits, and all their deputies. And the whole thing coalesces. Think of all this as a column of figures. You draw a line, you take off the total of that column of figures, and that total is the Supreme Being at any given moment. And since these figures are getting larger and larger all the time, the total is growing larger and larger all the time. The Supreme Being is the total of everything that's happening in finite experience. Let me use an illustration. If I stand up and pick up this chair, You all know that my feet push down just as hard as my arms push up, don't they? I got to have something to stand on to pick up the chair. And the down thrust of my feet is exactly equal to the up pull of my arms, right? All right? That's our experience as we go through the universe, as we grow. Every time we make a decision, the up pull of the arms is ours, but the down thrust of the feet goes to the Supreme Being. And that is why our growth adds to his growth. He gets the repercussion of every good or bad thing that we do. And repercussion is nothing but a fancy word which says when you pick something up, your feet have to push down on the floor just as hard as your arms pull up. Are you with me? Let's just consider, let me get a little technical now for some of you folks that have been a little farther along in this book. I don't think that ordinary decisions we make repercuss in the Supreme Being. But I think the minute you get to worship and wisdom, it does, because the adjutant of worship and the adjutant of wisdom repercusses in the local universe Mother Spirit, doesn't it? And when you get to her, you've hit God the sevenfold. And when you hit God the sevenfold, then I can understand how it repercusses in the Supreme Being. We carry with us as our personal experience and as our character growth all the experience of picking up the chairs. And let that chair symbolize any burden, any responsibility, any moral weight that you pick up or spiritual load that you carry. But the Supreme Being cashes in on the down thrust of our feet every time. It repercusses in the Supreme. And when you figure how many people there are on this world, what do we add up to now? About 4 billion? Every one of those 4 billion people are repercussing in the Supreme. Every human being everywhere is doing this. Every angel, every person is doing this. This is a lot of repercussion, isn't it? It's pounding in there all the time. And of course the Supreme Being is working too. Now, let's consider what things are like when they get perfect. This world is perfect. Perfected. What we would call utopia. What the papers call being settled in light and life. Are we in business? Consider what this world would be like if it were really perfected. No war, no armies, no navies, no air force. What's more to the point, no police force, no courts. There's no crime. Why have a police force when nobody commits any crime? There are no locks because nobody steals anything. You leave your door unlocked because, well, if anybody needed something, they might come in and borrow it, but they'd bring it back. Everybody is honest. Everybody is honorable. And what's even more important, everybody is skillful in living with other people. You know, it's not enough just to want to do right. You can be an awful, bumbling do-gooder. I have a kind of a cold horror of do-gooders because they can mess your life up. Your enemies you can cope with, but some of your friends, you know. When all worlds are like that, people really learn to live together in peace and harmony. They learn to live together constructively. There isn't any more gossip. There isn't any more status seeking. There isn't any more being vainglorious and talking big. There may be accidents, sure. There are still a few problems, but people know how to cope with them, and they're small problems. There isn't too much sickness, because science has made real progress. This is a world we would call utopia. People treat each other like brothers. People actually live the way Jesus lived. Jesus personally lived as though he were living in a society, in a civilization that was built like this. Remember, it said he was personally settled in life and life, regardless of the condition of the first century AD on this world. And that's one of the reasons, incidentally, why he looks a little odd to us. He was living as a truly civilized man lived. And we're not truly civilized. I think Arnold Toynbee describes us accurately and kindly when he speaks of us as man in process of civilization. As long as we kill each other, we sure aren't civilized. Yes.
But was Satan nothing on his name?
No. Satan was a local universe native. Yes. And Satan was not created in perfection. He was created far above the human estate, but not a perfect being. He still had the choice, right. Satan was created right out here in time and space. So was Lucifer. So was Caligastia. So were all the other people involved in this rebellion. But even if they hadn't been, even if they'd been created on paradise, when they come out here, they could choose evil. Jesus had the capacity to choose badly. He didn't have to choose good.
I know, put it in.
That's right. Jesus could have chosen badly. So the experience was a real adventure for him, an honest test. And if he couldn't choose badly, it wouldn't be a real adventure, would it? If you're playing poker for no money, this isn't poker, is it? But if you're playing poker for keeps, this is real poker. And the game that's played out here is real poker, played with real money. You win or you lose. When every evolutionary world, everywhere, and there's a lot of them, when every evolutionary universe, everywhere, in all the 7 super universes, have earned their perfection, when every evolutionary world, everywhere, and there's a lot of them, when every evolutionary universe, everywhere, in all the 7 super universes, have earned their perfection, then the Supreme Being will have finished his growth. And this can happen, this can actually happen because this is a finite goal. It has an end. And if it's got an end, sooner or later we can reach it. I don't care how far away it is. We're making progress. We get there. It's just like playing on a football field that's 1,000,000 yards long. If you keep making first downs and live long enough, you'll make a touchdown. You're bound to. I don't care how long it takes, and it's going to take a long time. We've done some figuring on how long it may take, and in case you'd like to know our estimate, it's about 10,000 trillions of years. And that may be no better than a wild guess, but it's the best calculating I can put together based on the figures which they give us here.
Our time.
Mm-hmm. Or 10,000 times as long as it took our sun to get born, you know. That's a long time, 10,000 trillions of years. You want to get a feeling for it? The national debt is still less than a third of $1 trillion. It's a little over a quarter of $1 trillion. The national income of this country is about $500 billion per annum. And if each one of those dollars was years, and if we had twice as much income as we had, then 10,000 times that much would be the length of time it would take. That's a long, long time. When this happens, then the Supreme Being is going to complete his evolution. And this means a number of things. First of all, we're going to be able to find him. Because all during the time that he's growing, we can't find him. We'll get all kinds of circumstantial evidence that he's there. We'll find all kinds of clues that he's there. But we won't actually find him, as we're going to find God on Paradise, and we'll find the Son, as we'll know Jesus. When he has finished his growth, that is the end of all finite experience. Because the papers instruct us that we can have finite experience only because he's growing and we're growing within him, in a sense. When he has finished his growth, all finite experience will come to an end everywhere. He's going to become the sovereign of these 7 super universes. And he will be a different kind of a sovereign than the people who are now ruling these universes, and who will then become his vice president, if you please. He will be a different kind of a sovereign because he will have earned this sovereignty. You remember our 2 men we talked about, the one who was born rich and turned out very fine, and the boy that was born poor and earned it? The Supreme Being is the poor boy who earns it. And he knows every step on the way up. Let's see if we can get a feeling for this. And again, I go back to Jesus for my illustration. Remember that Jesus is a son of God. And God created him full of compassion and love. I don't think that anybody has to teach him anything about affection and love. But do you think he ever knew what it was to be fatigued, to be tired? No, not as a divine son. Did he ever know what it was to be hungry and experience the real pleasure of eating food when it's well past your mealtime and you've been working hard? No. Did he know what it was like to sweat on a hot day when he was doing pretty heavy manual labor? No. Do you suppose he could possibly on Paradise have dreamt of what it would be like to be in the house of Caiaphas and be tormented and tortured and spit upon by his servants? Do you suppose he could possibly have realized what it would be like to be tried unfairly, to be convicted in violation of all of the code of jurisprudence which was supposed to govern the Supreme Court of the Commonwealth of Israel?
Well, that was his reason for saying yes, wasn't it?
Certainly.
So he
Exactly. Exactly. And the point I'm trying to make is that even an infinite God cannot create a being with this kind of knowledge. He can make him perfect. He can fill him with compassion. He can endow him with patience. He can make a creator of him. But there's some things that even God cannot give his children. They've got to come out here and get them himself. I think every being that God gives personality to has a sense of humor. in potential. But I don't believe that sense of humor ever becomes active and wakes up until they come out here in time and space. I don't think you can develop a sense of humor on Paradise. But I think any personality born on Paradise who comes out in time and space is going to get a good, healthy sense of humor before he's worked out here very long. Humor, I think, is born in time and space, not on Paradise. They tell us, for example, these technical advisors. They're the lawyers who advise people of procedure. They're not pedophaguing lawyers. They're constructive lawyers. They're the people who tell you, now, if you want to do something, here's the way to do it. This will work. They can't create these beings. They have to evolve these beings. No, you think of what Jesus was like when he left here in contrast to what he was like when he came here. And great as he was when he came here, he was greater when he left. And nobody can ever tell him, "Bus you there, Charlie?" Nobody can ever say to him, "Well, after all, you had it made." Nobody can ever say, "Well, you should live on a planet where we had it tough." Because he had it pretty tough down here, and he died pretty tough.
But to be truthful, he had it tougher than any of us. Because a lot of us make mistakes.
Sure.
And do things that he didn't.
That's
I
right.
knew that he was human. I mean,
Sure, he was human.
he would have, he had just as much compassion as we have,
Sure.
not more.
He had a great deal more. He could suffer more because he loved more. The two go hand in hand. Michael could never have wept over Jerusalem. Only a Jew could have wept over Jerusalem. And Jesus was a real Jew with all of the loyalty to his father's people, which he should have had. And when he thought how hard they'd worked, and he saw them fumbling the ball, no wonder he wept. He had a loyalty to his people, as well as a loyalty to the whole human race. No, I don't think any Gentile could have wept over Jerusalem. It could never mean to a Gentile what it meant to a Jew. It's a little shocking to think of him as a Jew, but he sure was. The Supreme Being is like Jesus. He's got battle scars. You can't hurt God, really, except emotionally, but you can hurt the Supreme Being. The Lucifer rebellion is just like a cancer within the Supreme Being, just like an infection. And in the same way that your white leukocytes wall off an infected area, so do they isolate in the universe as an area touched with rebellion until the infection is brought under control. I see many parallels between a living organism and the living universe. The Supreme Being, when he finally emerges, he is put together not only out of the Trinity's concept of God on the finite level. The Supreme Being intimately knows every human hope, every human dream, every human sorrow. The Supreme Being intimately knows everything that's happened on the entire finite level. And when he emerges, we're going to have a very great satisfaction. Basically, we can never know all about God because God is infinite. But here is God on the finite level, and we are really going to understand the Supreme Being. We sustain a relationship to the Supreme Being that's quite similar to the relationship which Jesus sustains to the Universal Father. We are flesh of his flesh and bone of his bone. We are the children of experience, and he is the God of experience. He's going to be just plain understandable to us. That's what they're talking about when they talk about secondary, supreme, finite integration. Now let's see some differences. First of all, this is not primary, this is secondary. And it doesn't mean secondary in the sense of being subordinate. It's secondary in the sense of being number two, which follows number one. It's finite, just like the previous caption. But it's finite integration instead of finite association. This is not a loose association holding together a lot of changing things. This is a unification, a real sovereignty that extends uniformly throughout the finite domain. And it's having a sovereign who has earned the right to rule. Jesus comes out into time, Michael comes out into time and space, and he starts out ruling in his Father's name because he is a son of God. He's the boss's son. That's why he's vice president. Later on, he earns his right to rule. And in the end, he rules as the supreme would rule, by the proven right of experience. In other words, he's proved he's a good hand, as well as the boss's son.
In other words, he's
He's learned
learned it from the ground up.
it from the ground up, exactly. He was born to wealth, and he's got the experience of both of these men we talked about. He was born to wealth, but he worked from the ground up, and it was a legitimate workout. Not one of these deals where you have 1 week in the stock room, 1 week in the plant, 1 week on the road, and then you're executive vice president. Does this get you a little bit through the first two of these?
Yeah, it makes the same being pretty wonderful aspect of realizing that sometimes you will know.
Yes, it does. In a way, it's a double compensation. First of all, it's a compensation to us for the fact that we can never know God, finally. We can really know the Supreme and understand Him. Secondly, it's a compensation to God. God never had the experience of starting from scratch. He's always been infinite, and He can't do anything about it. But through the Supreme, He can see what it would have been like to have started from nothing and amounted to something. God is sharing in this experience too, just as He shares in our experience.
Well, Bill, I think you made the Supreme thing a little clearer to me. I haven't been able to get
Goldie, the Supreme Being is not only God on the finite level. The Supreme Being is our elder brother because He's like all creatures. We can experience a fraternity with the Supreme. I
Well,
come...
I don't know whether I can make it clear to you. I know this might be a question for your baby,
Fine.
but as long as I can understand the Father and Son, no less. But I just don't get the question in my mind. Not to accept. Now let's say accept
The Supreme Being.
the Supreme Being.
Well, I'll tell you why you don't. The concept is almost entirely new to Christian theology. Father, Son, and Spirit we're familiar with. paradise is not so hard to understand because God has to live somewhere. And we sort of slip paradise in the slot that we'd reserve for heaven. You know what I mean? Or the last heaven. So this all fits, but the Supreme Being is foreign to our thinking. It's not foreign to Western philosophy. There are philosophers who are trying to understand an evolutionary universe, and they still want to have God, and so they visualize a finite God who is evolutionary. They got a pretty good picture of the Supreme Being. But when they accept a finite God, then they tend to reject an infinite God. And the papers are the only thing I have ever encountered which presents both concepts. And it's so understandable. I just know darn good and well God did not create this world because it's too imperfect. It's not his handiwork. It's produced indirectly. To me, Jesus revealed the universal Father.